Hello BBPC family. Our midweek Bible study, we're now in James chapter 3 verses 1 to 5. Today I'll just take up to first part of verse 5. This is a nice break-off point there. Once again, James chapter 3 verses 1 to 5a. Let me read in the ESV version. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. For we all stumble in many ways. And if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle his whole body. If we put bits into the mouth of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so large and driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. Now, a bit of background. The latter part of chapter 2, right before the passage today, talked about true faith being manifested in good works. James here in this passage was implying that part of that good works is it involves proper speech. And in verse 1, Paul was addressing the believers who are desiring or intending to teach. And as we know, those who teach, they're held to higher standards and expectations. After all, teachers use speech as their primary medium of communication, talking to the audience, to students to impart knowledge, instruction, also to help with understanding, and to also help with critical thinking skills and give life applications. So teachers, they have great influence. And thus, teachers could be more prone to sin through bad speech and possibly discrediting Christian witness. The situation James was addressing was very likely that many believers, including leaders, they were seeking the status of a teacher without good moral character. Then teachers were highly looked up to. And perhaps a number of them were quite quarrelsome. They were slanderous or unkind. They were critical, arrogant, and even deceitful. These attributes are actually hinted throughout the letter of James as he addresses the church there. Now moving to verse 2, it speaks just about the difficulty of keeping our speech in check. Do you know of anyone who's able to be so-called perfect in their speech, who's never been critical, who's never used profanity, or I don't think we know of anyone who's perfect in their speech, right? So James, he used three metaphors to illustrate just the power of speech. Firstly, he illustrated using the bits in a horse's mouth. All three metaphors kind of illustrate the smallness of an object, but how it controls such a big object. So once again, firstly, he talked about bits used in a horse's mouth, how the bit can really control the movement of a big horse, relatively speaking. And then secondly, he used the illustration of the rudder. A rudder relative to the big ship that it directs is very small compared to the large ship. And just how a small device can really control a big ship in its direction. Third, he illustrated using a small fire of how quickly once ignited, it can in a brush or forest, it can just result in a big forest fire. We see this quite often in certain parts of the world. For example, California seasonally always get big wildfires because of the dry weather and a lot of dry trees. So these three metaphors are very common in James's days in literature. These things, both the bits in the horse's mouth, the rudder in the ship, and the small fire become a big one. So James, like Jesus, just uses everyday illustration that are very, very familiar to the audience to illustrate the point. And I was thinking today, what's a illustration that's suitable for our context today? I just thought about the coronavirus, right? It's tiny and it's invisible, but yet it resulted in a worldwide pandemic. And what a huge impact it is for something that is so microscopic. So that's also a suitable illustration. So what we say, and not even what we say, but how we say things, are really indicative of what's in our minds and our hearts. Of course, this is not true though with insincere speech or lies, because when we're insincere, when we lie, they actually betray our integrity. So really the key verse is at the end. It's in the first part of verse 5. It says, "So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things." The boasts here is actually in a more negative sense. I'll allow the next devotion next week to talk about these aspects of boasting in a negative sense. A number of other verses come to mind when talking about speech, especially for Christians. We can first look within James. There's a number of verses within James' letter here. The first is verse 19 in chapter 1. James chapter 1 verse 19. It talks about being quick to listen and slow to speak. How wise advice that is. And later on in chapter 1 verse 26, it talks about true religion being involving bridling or controlling one's tongue. Imagine that. True religion involves bridling one's tongue. So that's important that we watch our speech. And a little bit past today's passage in James chapter 4, verses 1 and 11, it talks about the situation James was addressing where there's been quarrels, there's speaking of evil against one another. It's sometimes the reality of the church, the way we could be towards each other in our speech. And cross-referencing another part of Scripture in New Testament, in Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, it asks us to, for our speech to be seasoned with salt, to be positive, to be building up. And in Proverbs in the Old Testament, there's many verses you'll find that singles out speech as a measure of godliness. I'll just give one example. Proverbs chapter 18, verses 6 to 7. Proverbs chapter 18, verses 6 to 7. Okay, it says, "A fool's lips walks into a fight, and his mouth invites a beating. A fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are a snare to his soul." So it equates be it foolish talk or talk that is not self-controlled, to a fool. So these are warnings, a lot of warnings and words of wisdom in Proverbs relating to our speech. And last but not least, self-control is the last listed characteristic of the fruit of the Spirit found in Galatians 5. So that also involves our self-control in our speech, what we say. And it's not just what we say, it's also what we don't say. So I'll just mention a few application points for us. Again, what we say or what we don't say is just as important. And not only that, it's how we say things. It's our tone of voice, even our body language, that can reflect what we're trying to communicate. In reality, we sometimes get into quarrels with family members, and without realizing we might have critical spirit, and it comes out in our speech. We mumble off the side, criticisms. Sometimes we don't even realize we're actually gossiping because we're talking about someone in a negative sense behind someone's back. Or sometimes we badmouth our colleagues. And without realizing, sometimes we're a bit arrogant in our speech, whether it be about ourselves or something, and sometimes we lie or white lies, or we hide the truth, and we know that this is also displeasing to God. And it's not just verbal speech. And back then, in James's time, there's no computers, there's no social media. But in our times, it's not just our verbal speech; it's also our written words. Right? Be it writing an email, what we put in chats, messaging one another, what we write in blogs, and especially social media posts. In this modern day, we're coming with new vocabularies in the advent of technology and social media. Words like flaming, doxing, and trolling. These are terms that really speak of the way we communicate a lot nowadays through social media. And flaming, doxing, and trolling are all negative terms and we can see that as also poor conduct in our speech with words, though not verbal, more like typed or written words. I like to summarize in play with alliteration. I often like to do this. I love playing with words and using alliteration to help us remember. The takeaway is six sensibilities for sound speech. I'm going to list 6 sensibilities for sound speech. First, the first S is in our speech, is it seasoned with salt? Is it seasoned with salt? It means, does it build up rather than tear down? Secondly, is our speech spirit-led? I think if our speech is spirit-led, there'd be no cause for stumble. And the third S, is our speech self-controlled? Is it filtered first? Are we slow to speak, quick to listen? And do we control? Are we self-controlled in our speech? The fourth S is our words sensitive? Do we think first how our words might affect others? Right. So the fourth one is our speech sensitive? The fifth one is our words sincere, which basically is trying to imply that do our words have no deceit? We have no ill intent or to hide things or to deceive someone, right? Being insincere, perhaps in flattery even. And the last S, the sixth S, is silence. You might be surprised by this one. Why do I say silence? It means silence when appropriate. Sometimes it's better to refrain and not to say anything, especially, for example, in the heat of a moment, when we might erupt in what we say, and that might be unhelpful that we can't take back. So sometimes silence is appropriate. So once again, the 6 sensibilities for sound speech. Firstly, seasoned with salt. Is it spirit-led? Is it self-controlled? Is it sensitive? Is it sincere? And at times, do we want to be silent? Okay. So that sums it up. I have provided some reflection questions for us to ponder upon. And may our week in our conduct, especially in our speech, be encouraging to others to build up and not tear others down. Have a good week.